gbviews@gbnews.com, email, we get those emails coming in. But look, after the protesters also disrupted the wedding of former Chancellor George Osborne, should there be a more serious crackdown on these protesters if they pose a serious security risk? I want to ask, what should be considered off-limits for these eco-protests? So joining us now is the Scientist for Extinction Rebellion, is Pete Knapp, and Mark Hoath from Reform UK. Pete, I will start with you. What is off-limits, do you think, for eco-activists?
It's a good question. I think you're right in questioning this. I mean, when the Prime Minister's house is being scaled by people, yeah, that's a serious security threat. And something which I would like to ask is, what are the national security threats in the UK at the moment? And the UK National Risk Register 2023, they had terrorism within the next 2 years costing about £90 billion as a projection. Whereas in climate-related over the next 5 years is 65 billion, with fatalities exceeding 2,000 in their report. But we know from last year, for example, 56,000 people in England and Wales died from the heatwave. So, yeah, in terms of national security, we have a lot to think about. But it's predominantly related to climate-related things. For example, like 90% of the items in the National Risk Register related to the climate situation. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, when we look at these kinds of things, we think, well, how would it have been if these people had an Uzi, right? Or what I would like to reframe this as Rishi Sunak having the Uzi using oil as bullets.
I get that, and I'm sure you would like to reframe it as that. And I do understand where you're coming from. You know, for you, the environment is the big thing, right? But I'm going to ask Mark now. Mark Hoath, for Reform UK. I mean, I clearly am very much on the side of you should not rock up at someone's house or their wedding or a christening or a funeral, for goodness sake, and cause this kind of disruption. You know, should this be considered off limits? It's not kosher.
Well, absolutely. Of course it's off limits. I mean, the thing is, first of all, the events of this morning, I mean, that's breaking and entering, so it's against the law to start off with. You know, Extinction Rebellion talk about doing civil disobedience in a non-violent way, but breaking into somebody's house and sitting on their roof and unfurling banners is just completely out of order. And we've had this all summer, haven't we? Well, all summer and sort of at the back end of spring with Just Stop Oil spoiling sporting events. You know, Just Stop Oil, you know, ruining things like, you know, the cricket, the snooker. You know, we've had this right the way along the line. Now, these people, what they need to do is they need to stand up and stand for Parliament and see how many votes that they get for their, you know, frankly, rather extreme policies. You know, that's the bottom line with it, Patrick.
Pete, I'll throw it back to you because you've just rattled off some statistics there, right? And I do speak to quite a few members of Just Stop Oil as they do various different bits and bobs, and they appear to me, anyway, to be getting increasingly hysterical. And as this doomsday clock is ticking, if people who really buy into what I might refer to as climate alarmism sometimes, for these people who really buy into that, the clock is ticking, and I think that justifies more and more and more extreme levels of action. And that's what I'm worried about. How long is it before people start dying at their hand and not because they're all burned to death?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I'm a scientist, but we know the government is treating science with contempt. That we have the International Energy Agency saying no new fossil fuels to align to 1.5. We have the UN saying that we're spiralling towards global boiling. We have the highest temperatures in human existence, catastrophically low Antarctic winter ice. And you speak to anyone who's just come back from holiday in Spain or Greece or Turkey, and they'll tell you what is really happening.
Pete, I'm going to stop you there. Those fires were arson. And I was in Greece at the time, and the Greek media was reporting on it being arson. And it was only people over here and various different other places across Europe where they decided to ignore that and say it was climate change. Can I just ask, satellites show, this is according to the Royal Society, satellites show that since the early 2000s, when 3% of the world was on fire, caught fire, that's down now to 2.2%. Wildfires are lower. 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef is now experiencing record high coral growth. We have more polar bears than we did 10 years ago. Are people being quite selective with the science, Pete, and getting very, very worked up? Because, as I've just proved, and you've just proved, we can both quote stats and they can both be completely different.
Sure. I'm going to disagree with you on many of those things. Not to say that what you're saying is false, but I'm saying that there is a chance that there is a danger here of cherry picking, and this is exactly what's happening with the Conservative government. They're saying that no, that new oil and gas is going to be serving our national energy security, right? This is the kind of stuff that they're saying. But when you actually scrutinise this for a second, we realise that that's totally wrong. We export 80% of what we get from the North Sea. We import most of the gas from Norway, not from Russia. Scotland produces 6 times more gas than it needs. And any new fossil fuels now come online in about 10 years.
OK, all right. Look, Mark, I'll throw it to you because, when I look at some of these things, I hear stats like that. I also hear as well various different figures that I've got here. For example, like solar and wind deliver less than 4% of Europe's total energy. That leaves me quite fearful for the future, is whether or not we could end up being self-sufficient or, living in the dark on beds of moss for the rest of our lives just to appease people. Mark, what's your take on whether or not we should now actually be doing more to appease some of these environmentalists?
No, because the thing is, let's just pick up on the points around the temperatures that was just discussed and just talked about. I can remember being in Greece in 1986. It was 44 degrees, exactly the same as what was being predicted by the BBC weather last week. And actually, it never actually turned out to be at that level either. So let's just be clear on that. There's a lot of false narrative going on around this, with the red weather maps and, the whole doomsday scenario around it to start off with. So, no, we shouldn't be appeasing them whatsoever. It's hysterical for the point of being hysterical. And as I say, that's the big problem. Now, it's all very well going to sit on Rishi Sunak's house. We contribute 1% of this, 1% of CO2. China, contributes a lot more than that. Now, I don't think they'll be going to sit on
Pete, that is a point.
Will they, and unfurling? They wouldn't last very long if they were starting to do that, would they?
Pete,
so
that is a point. That is a point. I actually seriously do think, and I'm all joking aside, I'm being serious now, I do honestly think, Pete, that a lot more ordinary Brits would have more respect for groups like Greenpeace and Just Stop Oil and, dare I say, Extinction Rebellion as well, if they went and tried this on at the Chinese embassy. You wouldn't have to go to China. Why are you picking soft targets like this?
Yeah, I can sympathise with the idea, because when we look at China's emissions, we do think, well, that's out off the scale. But we've got to ask ourselves, why are their emissions off the scale, and where do we buy everything that we get in the UK? That's one thing. But the second thing is the cumulative emissions from China over the last 150 years is minuscule compared with what it is in the UK.
But that's because
we're the 6th highest in the world.
Country. Yeah, but to be fair, Pete, you did talk earlier on about cherry-picking figures as well, didn't you? And it's because China is
That's not cherry-picking.
Well, it is, because China is massively industrialised in the recent times. So when we have to consider emissions per person. It's not like it's not emissions as a country, because then the biggest countries obviously are going to emit the most, and China is one of the biggest countries in the world. So we have to compare it to the population, not the size of the country. Look, Pete, if I turned up at your house, right, and scaled your house, and sat on your roof, or rocked up at your wedding and just ruined it or did whatever, because I was saying, Pete, you've made me get a new heat pump, or I've had to sell my car and get an electric car, and I'm skint, I can't feed my kids. Right? How would you feel about that?
Well, if someone were to come to my house with a genuine concern, as people did at Just Stop Oil, a group of people infiltrated Just Stop Oil party, right? They had some balloons helium balloons with a siren on them, and let them off in the hall. Totally disrupted it. How did the Just Stop Oil respond?
It's not the same as going round to someone's home, Pete.
Well done.
It's not the same. Look, Pete, it's not the same as going round to someone's home. I don't care how much money he's got or any of this stuff. His wife and kids will not feel the same in that house after this. I wouldn't feel the same in that house after this. And I don't think that's right. I think there are limits to it. Look, thank you very much, both of you. We could talk about this all day, and we can't.
How are the people going to feel when they're flooded out of their homes, right? How are people going to feel when their houses are burned to the ground? This is a very, very different situation.
Well, I think it's going to be fascinating. I do think it's going to be fascinating to see how you would feel if you are proven wrong in a few years' time, actually, and you're going to have a lot of humble pie to eat. But we'll have to wait.
Get me on. I'd be thrilled if I was wrong.
Really? So would everyone else, to be fair. But Pete, thank you very much. Pete now, of course, is Scientist for Extinction Rebellion, and Mark Hoath, who's a Reform UK. Look, lively stuff at the top of the hour. Now,